I'm starting here with Pennypack because I left off with that this morning. Pennypack in the northern part of the city of Philadelphia. And some of you nodded that you know where that is. Founded by Elias Cooch, the young man who was about 18 years old and was saved under his own sermon, called to be the pastor of that church. And in his first message, he was saved from his own preaching. Of course, the seed had been sown in his heart for a number of years. The Pennypack Baptist Church is the oldest Baptist church in Pennsylvania, still in existence. Now, the one that when he was saved, he went over to the Delaware River and was baptized by a Baptist preacher over near Bristol. That church that baptized Cooch went out of existence by 1715. So the Pennypack Church, and at that time, the Bristol Church was the only Baptist church around. And so now the Pennypack Church is actually the oldest surviving Baptist church in the state. And it became the mother church of the First Baptist Church of Philadelphia, founded in 1689. And so the First Baptist of Philadelphia is an old church. The building itself, not that old, though it does go back to the 1800s, which is a long time ago. Not colonial. Anything 1800 on is not colonial anymore, but still a magnificent building. It has a liberal heritage for the last few years, so I cannot endorse what they preach because I've lost contact with when they started going liberal. I did, but I'm very interested, and I think we should be interested in these old colonial churches because of their heritage, because of what they stood for and the things that they fought for and won for us, including religious liberty. And John Leland, which is the DVD I was talking about, Magnificent Heritage, was one of the Baptist preachers who did probably the most, if I could measure the wealth of benefit they gave to us. He probably did more than any other man for winning for us the separation of church and state. I mean, James Madison, who was the president of the Constitutional Convention when we were becoming a nation, went to Virginia and went to John Leland's home and asked his wife if he could speak with the preacher because he understood that the preacher had really been speaking hard on some separation of church and state issues, and I'd like to talk with him. And she said, well, Mr. Leland, he's back in Gum Springs, back in the woods, he's praying. Back there, he has his Bible back there, he's praying. And I can tell you how to get to it because he always prays under the same old tree, an oak tree, which they believe is still standing until recently a storm came through and blew the tree down. Just recently. Maybe God is telling us something, you know. But James Madison went back there and spent hours with John Leland. And he was influenced in how our Constitution, our Bill of Rights was worded. And when James Madison stood up in the Constitutional Congress and read the Bill of Rights, John Leland was sitting over in the balcony, and Madison looked right over at him and smiled in appreciation to his influence. I mean, the Baptists, the early colonial Baptists, suffered and were punished, and many of them died for the faith. And if I could give a Baptist seminar, I think just on the Baptist martyrs from the colony of Virginia, and good men who died for the faith. So the First Baptist in Philadelphia actually was part of the Pennypack Church for a number of years. It wasn't until 1746 that it became independent. Now, one of the very famous pastors of the First Baptist Church of Philadelphia was a man named Morgan Edwards. And I mentioned him briefly this morning, the materials that he traveled and collected towards the writing of a Baptist history. He was the pastor for a good decade before the war for independence. And he was a Welshman, and he served as pastor here beginning in 1761. Now, it is true that well, first of all, I will say this. He graduated from Bristol College in England, which became the model college for Spurgeon's pastor's college, his pastor's school. Bristol College was the first Baptist college anywhere. Brown University became the first school of Baptist higher learning in this country, but Bristol was before all of that. Morgan Edwards was a premillennialist. Several years ago, there was a man who put up a $500 bet. If anyone could show him where anyone in America had written or preached any sermon or published any sermon on the pre-tribulational rapture, the pre-trib rapture, that Christ is going to rapture the church just before the tribulation period. He said, if anyone can find anyone who even mentioned that in this country before 1800, is the way he put it, before 1800, I'll give him $500, because he was so sure that no one could find anything. Well, someone knew Morgan Edwards' materials well enough to go to Morgan Edwards' works, and he had preached sermons on the pre-trib rapture. And this guy had to pay out his $500 to, I don't know who it was who won the bet, but they proved that he was a pre-trib. And Morgan Edwards was at the same time as James Manning, the founder of Brown University, the pastor of First Baptist Church of Providence, Rhode Island, in the Second Great Awakening. Morgan Edwards was a contemporary with him and helped him to found Brown University. And this is what I started to say earlier. Morgan Edwards became the only prominent Baptist leader to oppose the American War for Independence. That was very unusual. And I could probably count the total number of Baptist preachers who opposed that war. Once it got started, they didn't oppose it, but they didn't want it to get started. But I could count the Baptist preachers on the fingers of one hand and have fingers left over of pastors who opposed it, because they knew they didn't have any choice but to go to war. So, but just before the war started, Morgan Edwards moved to Welsh Tract, from Philly to Welsh Tract. It was safer there for him than for being in Philadelphia. And so he came and he joined the Welsh Tract Baptist Church, which is just down the road from where we're sitting right now, as many of you know. And because we even have a Welsh Tract, is it road, Welsh Tract Road here? Yeah. And so that church was headquarters for Morgan Edwards for a few years there. The old Welsh Tract Church, the oldest primitive Baptist church in America, is right around the corner from us here. And it started by 16 Welsh people, Welsh believers. They started it in 1701 when they formed the original congregation. The original actually moved over here, immigrated from Wales, and they settled here in Delaware in 1703. And so some of you have probably passed by this church more times than we could dare count. But I don't know if you knew this, but there was one battle in the War for Independence that took place on Delaware soil. The first state, you know. But there was one battle, and that was the Battle of Cooch's Bridge. And during that battle, maybe they were trying to get to Morgan Edwards, I don't know, but maybe the Americans did. I'm just kidding, but no, they were British. But a cannonball passed right through that building and out on the other side. And if you look between the two windows, you can see where that cannonball went in, where they patched it up. Yeah, so if the people were in there, and I'm sure no one was holding a service at that moment, but they would have to duck. If they were seated, it would go over them, because it came out on the other side, straight shot, right between those two windows. So, So next time you drive by there, well, I don't think you can see it just by driving by. You would have to pull in to take a look at that. Now, Cooch himself, after whom the bridge is named, was a member of that church. In fact, he's buried in that cemetery. I believe that might be his marker right there. I'm not positive, the tall one. But primitive Baptists, the primitive Baptists have been hyper-Calvinist at times. I'm not saying all primitive Baptists are hyper-Calvinists, but at some periods in American history, the primitive Baptists were hyper-Calvinist to the point that they were not missionary. They opposed missions because they felt that God would just, without our help, save those that He wanted to save. Whereas we know that faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. And it pleases God through the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe. So that was one point that the old primitive Baptists were wrong about. But there have been some great people who came from the primitive Baptist movement. I even took a couple of pictures some years ago of the bridge over there. And this looks familiar, I know, to some of you. If you were to look at the marker there, I'm not going to give you a close-up of it. If you look at the historical marker up by the cannons, if you look at the last 4 lines, and if you ever stop by and read that, look at the last 4 lines. It says this was the only battle fought on Delaware soil, and it is believed to have been the first battle in which the stars and stripes were flown. Now, I don't know why that was, but that's what historians do believe. Let's go down to North Carolina quickly. We're there. And we're on Route 49. And we're out in the boonies. And we're between 2 towns. We're between Liberty and Ramseur. And you can recognize some of the big cities around: Greensboro, High Point, Burlington, Asheboro. But if we just stop by a road sign there between these 2 places, we will, between Liberty and Ramseur, we'll see a road sign that will point us. This is 2 miles from Sandy Creek Baptist Church. Now, this sign was put up by the government because it is a historical place, this Baptist church. It was founded in the First Great Awakening when a man named Shubal Stearns came down. He had been saved under George Whitefield's preaching in Connecticut. He came down to bring the gospel to the South, and he founded that church. So this sign says this is the mother of Southern Baptist churches, founded 1755 by Shubal Stearns, whose grave is there by the church 2 miles away. Now, most people ride by, and they read that sign. If they read that sign, they say, oh, here's the mother of all the Southern Baptist churches. Huh. And everyone knows what a Southern Baptist is. That's an SBC. Well, this is so deceiving because in 1755, there was no Southern Baptist Convention. There wasn't even a state convention. The Southern Baptist Convention was founded 90 years later in 1845. And so, and this was supposed to be, everyone always said, well, we're quoting from Morgan Edwards' materials. Well, if they did, they were guilty of changing the line, because Morgan Edwards said, mother of separate churches. Separate, not Southern, separate churches. So this both delighted me and amazed me. Just the other day, I noticed that they got it right. Look at that. So I guess someone complained. I don't know, but usually you can complain if the federal government or the state government has anything to do with it, they will do nothing. But they've changed it. Mother of separate Baptist churches across the South. That's correct. That's exactly the way Morgan Edwards said it. So I love it when they correct it. We all make mistakes, but it's good when we correct them. So there we are. I'm not going to read all the markers here. With this marker, here's actually a quote from Morgan Edwards, and I'm going to focus on this last paragraph, straight out of his material, describing the Sandy Creek Baptist Church as he visited this place whilst soon after Shubal Stearns was there. It is a mother church, nay, a grandmother and a great-grandmother All the separate Baptists sprang hence, not only eastward towards the sea, but westward towards the great river Mississippi, northward to Virginia, southward to South Carolina and Georgia. And the word went forth from this Zion, and great was the company of them who published it, insomuch that her converts were as drops of morning dew. That sounds like a real refreshing to me, a spiritual refreshing. I know George Whitefield often said there was a spiritual refreshing back there when I preached the word and the people came, the people were saved, God's people got right with the Lord. There was a spiritual cleansing, a spiritual refreshing. And Morgan Edwards says, drops of morning dew, spiritual blessings from God. Now, Shubal Stearns is buried there. Again, I'm skipping all the markers. There's his tombstone at the Sandy Creek Missionary Baptist Church. Now, he would serve there for some 15, 16 years, and approximately 16 years. But during that short ministry of Shubal Stearns, from the time he founded the church to the time he died in 71, out of that one church came 42 other Baptist churches, separate Baptist churches, and 125 ministers they ordained and went out from that church. Some of them evangelists, some of them church planters from that one church. These men, the brother-in-law of Stearns was a man named Daniel Marshall. Marshall married Stearns' sister. And Daniel Marshall went on down to Georgia and founded the First Baptist Church in Georgia, in the colony of Georgia. And both of these men had been converted under the preaching of George Whitefield, the British evangelist, during one of his 7 trips to the colonies. Now, George Whitefield was not a Baptist. George Whitefield, when the Church of England kicked him out, never became any denomination. But he kept baptizing babies. And to the day he died, George Whitefield thought you should baptize the babies. And up in New England, during the First Great Awakening, which lasted from about 1720 to 1770 or 60, along in that period, 40 years, up in New England, the established church was the Congregational Church. The only legal church was the Congregational Church. If someone finds you worshiping someplace else, they may lock you up. They may lock the church doors too, as happened in many Baptist churches. I showed you this morning the First Baptist Church in Boston. The authorities came in there as soon as it opened and locked the doors, put padlocks on the doors and forbade them to come in to that church. So, I mean, these things were happening all up and down the establishment of, that's why we needed a disestablishment of religion. That's why we have a separation of the church and the establishment of churches. The government has no right to establish churches, government churches, state churches. Churches belong to God, and God's men establish churches and pastor them, and God's people attend them. But up in New England, and the Middle Colonies even, not Pennsylvania, because the Quakers were in control of Pennsylvania, and they believed in liberty. Now, thank God for the Quakers doing that. They didn't have a state church here. But up in New England and down all the way down South Carolina, Georgia, down there it was the Church of England that was the establishment. Up in New England it was the Congregational Church that was the establishment. And what happened was when Whitefield and men like Jonathan Edwards preached, those who became Christians would look at their churches they came out of and were baptized in as babies, and they felt, I can't go back to my home church because I've never even heard of someone getting saved in those churches. And so they became separates. And there were about 100 separate churches, a few more than that, in New England. And eventually those 90 to 100 and sometimes even more churches they're the ones that became separate Baptists. Many, hundreds of converts from George Whitefield's preaching became separate Baptists. And he didn't think much of it. He loved the fact that they were saved, but he lamented the fact that they were leaving the established church and becoming Baptists, rebaptizing people who really believe. In fact, Whitefield wrote one place in his diary, as he was traveling, he kept a diary, and he said, he was talking about these Baptists, even my converts. He said, "Lo, my chickens are becoming ducks because of the immersion." And so he didn't like it at all. Well, at Sandy Creek, the first building burned. The second building was built across the road, and a storm blew it over. And by the turn of the 19th century, they built a log building, which is still there, about 20 by 25 feet. And there it is, Sandy Creek Baptist Church. Now, what happened here, though, is towards the end of the 1700s, the separate Baptist and the regular Baptist, that's the ones who wouldn't get emotional, didn't like to see people coming forward. They were not liberals, but they were just dead. It was kind of like orthodoxy on ice. You know, the guy preaches the truth, but he has no passion whatsoever. And the separates were the new lights. The old regulars were old lights. And when the revival fires died down, the two groups, the separates and the regulars, merged together by 1785 and later. And when that happened, it caused such a division at Sandy Creek that a whole group of the congregation just walked out, started another church down the road, and eventually the few that remained just stopped going to church, and they turned the log college over to the primitive Baptist, the old school primitive Baptist, next door, gave them the property. And so the old school primitive Baptist owned that building and worship in that building to this day. By the turn of the 20th century, 1905, the descendants of the old missionary Baptists who walked out decided we need to go back and establish a missionary Baptist, Sandy Creek Missionary Baptist Church again. So they went back next door to the log college and reestablished the missionary, Sandy Creek Missionary Baptist Church. So next door to one another now. And there was one lady, I read of one lady during many of those years when they were not having services, the church had gone out of business. When she would go every Sunday morning, she would go over to the steps of that church, the old log college or the old log church, and she would sit on the steps and pray and read her Bible, praying for God to open it again, that God's blessings would come back. That's what happens many times when churches split over things that are not necessary to split over. But this godly woman just sitting on the steps of a church, the doors were locked. She couldn't get in. There was no preacher. There were no people. But she would pray for God to come back and for that church to open. And it did in the early 20th century. This is the old log building. That's the pulpit. They had 3 balconies around. And the Primitive Baptist, this is the sign in front of the log building, they meet every 3rd Sunday and Saturday night. So they do not even have church every Sunday. So, and they're very anti-missionary. And so they claim, well, Shubal Stern started our church. So not quite right, but this is the new building they built several years. Actually, it goes back to 1942 when they built this building. And so you can see in the distance the old school church. And in 2005, the missionary Sandy Creek Baptist celebrated the 250th anniversary of the church that Stearns established in 1755. Now today it is a Southern Baptist church. This one, the missionary church, it's Southern Baptist. They had Paige Patterson preaching for the 250th anniversary. That stained glass, round stained glass behind him, they call it the Eye of Shubal. He's looking at you. I'm not sure he would be pleased with everything the Southern Baptist Convention is doing, but there it is. And that's Sandy Creek. It's really sandy. They don't immerse in that creek anymore. I'm going to skip a few things right here. It describes the old invitation system, the giving the invitation. The preacher would walk among the people and speak and shake hands. And, brother, are you saved? And they would have a little platform up here, and the people come and kneel down. Long time before Charles Finney ever knew about an invitation system. The fire and the fervor of Whitefield lived on in the Baptist, the separate Baptist. Now, as I mentioned, Daniel Marshall, who went down to Georgia and started the First Baptist Church in Georgia, he went down to Appling, Georgia, near Augusta, Georgia. They call it the Kyoke Baptist Church because it was built next to the Kyoke Creek. So it was founded here in 1772 by the New Light, revivalist, Baptist, separatist preacher. And that building is still there. It's Southern Baptist Church today. They preach the gospel. I've been there several times, not to the church service, but I've talked with the pastors, several pastors over the years, and they still preach the gospel there. The First Baptist Church in Georgia. Skip that. But I love going to these places because it brings back to my memory things that I've read about them and how they stood for the faith. I mean, Daniel Marshall, it was against the law for him to even start that church. He was preaching in that church. His wife, Martha, was Shubal Stearns' sister. And the Georgia authorities just broke in, like they did up in Boston, up in Lynn, I was telling you about this morning. And they arrested Daniel Marshall because this was an illegal church service. Now, down in Georgia, the Church of England was the only legal establishment. So these Baptists were holding illegal services. And so they broke in there and broke up the service, and they arrested Daniel Marshall. While Martha took her husband's Bible in her hand and started quoting Scripture and saying, "This is what God says." I mean, she was probably preaching pretty well to him. And because some of the officers got saved. They literally got saved. And this is documented even in the secular history in the minutes of the courthouse there. They became born-again believers and joined the Baptist church. Even the chief one of the officers who arrested them, he became a Christian. So these men fought for our liberty and won it by God's grace. They have a little pool that is the water comes in it from the old Kyoke Creek right into the baptistry there. So you're looking at the dressing room of the old baptistry behind the church. Now, this is the modern church the building that they use now. I want to go back up north, up to Williams College briefly, because in 1805, in the Second Great Awakening, at the epitome of the Second Great Awakening, at Williams College up in the northwestern corner of Massachusetts, this college, among some other colleges, saw great revivals. But on the campus, there it is, on the campus of Williams College, and I'm going quickly through some of these because I want to get right here. There was a haystack. There was a hay barn, and there were 5 students who had gone. Let's say they went away on cuts to visit their family on a weekend for cuts. I don't know if they called them cuts in those days, but they were coming back to school to resume their classes, and on the edge of the campus, a severe thunderstorm came up. And these 5 students, these 5 college students, took refuge in a hay barn. And while they were there, they said, while we're waiting for the storm to pass over, let's have a prayer meeting for evangelism, for missions. The modern missionary movement was born in that haystack. As these 5 young men got a hold of God, burden for missions, burden for the lost. They went back and they graduated. And the fervor of the haystack prayer meeting became contagious with other students. Now these are Congregationalists. These are not Baptists. These are part of the established church up in Massachusetts. But, and you can see later they put a monument there in the backside of the campus with the globe on top, and they have a haystack embedded in it. But this is what the monument says, just what I just said to you. 5 students dedicating their lives to the service of the church around the globe. And out of this grew the American Foreign Mission Movement. The first mission board in this country was founded by these Congregationalists. And the names of the 5 are listed here by the haystack. And these 5 men, I'm not going to read them, but these 5 men went back to school, and there was a man named Adoniram Judson, a young man, Adoniram Judson, who got saved while he was a student. So this brand new convert, Adoniram Judson, is saved around these other students who are fervent for evangelism, on fire for God. And Adoniram Judson was called to the mission field, a brand new convert, college degree. And so these students graduated and went up to Andover, Massachusetts, or I should say over to Andover, Massachusetts, for their seminary training at Andover Theological Seminary. It's just 20 miles above Boston and Andover. And Andover Theological Seminary doesn't exist anymore, but it was using the campus of Phillips Academy. And Phillips Academy is still there. And this is a very elite academy. Men like Kennedy's and George Bush graduated from high school at Phillips. Now, the school itself folded in the early 20th century, actually. So these are some of the modern buildings on campus. But what I want to show you is the name of the road named after Adoniram Judson, because he was in the midst of these prayer meetings. So on the backside of the campus of Phillips Academy, there's a little road, Judson Road, and it leads you back to the rabbit's pond. You see the water in the background behind the trees. That's the rabbit's pond. And you see this big stone. And you walk around, and you see there's a plaque on that stone. And you walk up to it, and you can read that in this plaque was put up there in 1910, which was 100 years after the first mission board was founded by these students. In this missionary woods, once extending to this spot, the first missionary students of Andover Seminary walked and talked 100 years ago. And on this secluded knoll met to pray in memory of these men, Adoniram Judson, Samuel Knott, Samuel J. Mills, Samuel Newell, Gordon Hall, James Richards, and Luther Rice. And these men, all 7 of them, were ordained and commissioned in the Tabernacle Baptist Church in Salem, Massachusetts. They got on board the ships. Luther Rice was a single guy. In fact, he was engaged, but his wife decided she did not want to marry a missionary. So he never married. But he lost his love because of that. But God came first. And Adoniram was married. And the Judsons and Rice were on separate ships going to such places as Burma, India. And on board these separate ships, Adoniram Judson and Luther Rice began studying independently about baptism. They were Congregationalists, they were not Baptists. And on board the ships, not speaking to one another, separate ships, each one of them became a Baptist before they arrived in Burma or India. And they started comparing notes. saying, hey, that happened to me too. I'm a Baptist. I really cannot conscientiously accept support from the Congregationalist Mission Board. We're Baptists. And so Luther Rice came back to America and traveled all up and down especially the East Coast, raising money for missions and for education. And he established George Washington University, which is still there today, which is secular today. Luther Rice. There's so many stories that are true that you can share here. That's where the commission took place, up in Salem, Tabernacle Baptist Church. Now, Adoniram Judson died at sea, but there's a memorial to him on Burial Hill in Plymouth, Massachusetts. I want to take us to South Carolina. You can see some familiar places there if you can see the map that much. Greenville, South Carolina, places like that, Columbia. But where the red circle is, it says Saluda. And it takes us back to Luther Rice as he was traveling on one of his preaching tours, taking collections for missions. He died near Saluda. He was leaving the church. He had preached a series of messages at a Baptist church, and he was leaving. He was just a few miles down the road. And in his dying breath, he said, I want to be buried back in that lovely little Baptist church where I just preached. I'm not in the church, but in the cemetery there. It was called Pine Pleasant Baptist Church. That's where Luther Rice is buried. This great man for missions, for God. So I have been there a few times and taken a few pictures. There was a new building in 1831. And you see the grave with the canopy over it, the only grave with a canopy over it and an iron rail around it. That's where Luther Rice is buried. And I remember a number of years ago, almost 35 years ago, I was there. I had just written a book on the SBC House on the Sand, because that house on the sand was sinking quickly. And I exposed a lot of liberals. And one day I met with the pastor. It was a Southern Baptist church. I met with the pastor, and he stood over on one side of the rail here, and I was standing over on this end. We were talking. He was an elderly man, much older than I am. I'm sure he's in glory today because he was old then. That was 35 years ago almost. But we were talking. We had good fellowship together. He was a good man. He preached the gospel. And I looked over at him, and he had tears running down his eyes. And I didn't say anything. He said, brother, and I had said nothing about the SBC and a book I wrote. He said, you wrote SBC House on the Sand, didn't you? And I said, yes, sir, I did. And he said, thank God you wrote that book, because the liberalism was just as bad and worse, because I attended 2 of those seminaries, and they were liberal to the core, and we're losing our churches. We're losing the faith. And he and I just rejoiced. I wanted to say, why don't you come out then, but I didn't, and I shouldn't have at that moment. It was not the time to. But many things along the way. And we'll take our